Hello everybody! I'm going to introduce you to a new artist now, and her name is Faith Ringgold. Faith Ringgold is right here, and she is a quilting artist. So let's see what that means. Quilt. First, let's learn about the word quilt. A quilt is a blanket with patterns of shapes and colors stitched into it or sewn into it. So here's 3 examples of quilts, 1, 2, 3, and they're all blankets with different patterns that are sewn into them. Some quilts are very simple and just have square patterns, and some are very complex and have different types of shape patterns. Faith Ringgold is an artist who creates quilts. So she stitches all these patterns into the sides of her quilts, but in the middle of her quilts, she always paints a story right onto the fabric of the blanket. Her stories are always things that she remembers from her childhood. That means when she was younger. So right here in the middle of her quilt is a story that she remembers from her childhood when she was growing up and playing with her friends. Here's another quilt that she created. You can see in the middle here her family, and they're having dinner on her rooftop apartment in the city. She loved to have dinner with her family and spend time with her family, so that's a memory that she remembers. Here's another memory that she remembers. This is when her mom took her and her sisters to a famous art museum, and guess what? She saw the Mona Lisa. So here's another story that she painted on her quilt. All of her quilts have stories, and they are very personal to her. So another group of artists that I want to introduce you to, these are called the Gee's Bend Quilters. The Gee's Bend Quilters are a group of artists, so that means they collaborate and they create art together. Here's one of them right here. They create these huge quilts. Notice how large this quilt is, and they stitch these quilts together, and they put these quilts into their community, and they sell them for money to make their communities better. So all the money that they earn from these quilts that they design together helps their community. So here's a group of the Gee's Bend Quilters, and they're all sewing together these huge quilts. Now take a look at this quilt right here. Do you notice some types of shapes that we just drew in our sketchbook? Are these geometric or are they organic shapes? If you're thinking they're geometric shapes, you are correct. Lots of squares and rectangles, lots of shapes that have points and angles and sides. Those are geometric shapes. So let's talk about why we're talking about Gee's Bend Quilters and Faith Ringgold. We are going to get some inspiration from both of those artists to create our own quilt design. Our quilts are going to be drawn onto paper. We're going to use geometric shapes to create 4 quilt designs and 1 story in the middle. We'll talk about the story a little bit later, because today we're going to start the quilt designs using geometric shapes. We learned from our sketchbook warm-up that geometric shapes are shapes such as squares and triangles, shapes that have points and straight lines and angles. We're going to use something called a grid today, boys and girls, to create our grid patterns for our quilt. So inside of this grid template that you'll find at your table, you're going to draw geometric shapes to make a pattern. Here are some examples of grid patterns. Notice how this pattern repeats this triangle shape over and over to create a design. They're only using geometric shapes, triangles, to create their patterns, and squares. Same thing for this design. They're only using squares and triangles, geometric shapes, to create this pattern. And same for this one. There's lots of different patterns that you can choose for your quilt. The possibilities are endless. You can create your own designs, or I have some examples for you to look at. You can try and copy some of these quilt designs that already exist. You can also create a picture or a letter or any type of shape, as long as you're putting these shapes together by using only geometric shapes, squares and triangles. So I said that I wanted one of my grid pieces, one of my quilt pieces, to be the letter N, and one of them to be a flower. So I really had to think very hard, how can I make a flower out of only triangles and squares? So in my video next, I'll show you exactly how I did that. We will talk about these stories a little bit later, but here's a great example from a 2nd grader last year. In their grid patterns right here, they're only using objects. This is a dog and a cat and an apple and a flower, and they're really thinking very hard, how do I turn these objects into a grid pattern by only using geometric shapes? So that's something that you can think about as well. So let's find out now how we start our grid patterns. I'm going to show you a second video how we put these geometric shapes together to make these 4 patterns.